Hey folks, welcome back to female reproductive hormones. We will call this the summary video. This worksheet is available at the bottom of the reproduction section of the website of the Weebly. It'll just be called Female Reproductive Hormones Summary. So if you want to print it out or something like that, that might work. If not, that's okay too. It wouldn't be too hard to sketch this out for yourself. So this is the summary sheet. Please make sure before you try this summary sheet and watch this video that you've actually watched the regular video on female reproductive hormones. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to chat about what happens with the hormones from the anterior pituitary. We're going to talk about what's going on in the ovary. And then we're going to talk about what's going on in the uterus. And remember, we give different things different names depending on where the events are happening. If things are happening in the ovaries, we call them certain or by certain names. And if they're happening in the uterus, then we give them different names, even for the same time period. So let's go back to the start here. So the gonadotropic hormones from the anterior pituitary. So maybe I'll even take a step back here since we're doing some review. Remember, the part of your brain that really starts the whole party is the hypothalamus. And it is going to release gonadotropic releasing hormones, GnRH. That talks to the anterior pituitary. And that anterior pituitary is going to release two hormones of its own. It's going to release LH and FSH. Oops. So again, that was actually the same series as the male reproductive system as well. It's just that the LH and the FSH do totally different things in the female system. So what I want us to look at here is sort of what happens in terms of levels over this 28-day cycle, this reproductive cycle in the female body. When we're looking at gonadotropic hormones, the LH and the FSH, the important date, really the only important date, is going to be the 14th, that sort of middle of the cycle. And remember, that's ovulation. That is when the follicle and the ovum have matured in the ovary, and the ovary is actually going to release that egg, that ovum, so that it can start making its trek from the ovary towards the uterus to potentially be fertilized. So this is actually pretty darn easy. What we have here, and we're looking for just sort of general trends, right? So let's go FSH. I'm going to do that in this orangey color. And I'll label it as well. And then maybe I'll go LH, we'll do it in this like indigo, sort of navy blue color. So FSH, both of these actually follow a really nice trend. This is going to be sort of the amount over on the left. I don't even know if you need to label this. Amount, level, something like that. Your FSH and your LH follow the same trend where they stay lowish and it bounces around a little bit, right? So my pen's, I'm not very good at drawing horizontal lines, and there might be little undulations, little up and downs in there, not a huge deal. What is a big deal is remember that we have this positive feedback, this spike, right from like day 12 to day 14, and then the spike drops off. So your FSH is going to stay at a fairly low level, and then you get this nice little bump right at ovulation, and then it returns back to a low level. Now your luteinizing hormone, your LH, it actually follows exactly the same trend. Again, you'll see pictures that are maybe more finicky with what's happening, but it's going to stay at a generally the same level. You could even draw it the same, but I don't want to draw the two lines directly over top of each other. it's going to do a spike in the middle as well. Oh, here, I said I would do this as well. So that was your FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which is causing the follicle to develop in the ovary. Your luteinizing hormone, it's going to spike as well, but it's going to do a much bigger spike. So it looks more like that. And then it goes back down to just low levels again. So there's your LH line. So really, all you need to know about LH and FSH is that they're low, 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 low through the first 12 days. Boom, they spike at ovulation. There's this big positive feedback. And then, hey, they go back down to some nice low level. And that is sort of the only spot in the whole system for both males and females where we actually do have some positive feedback happening. Remember, that's like going up to the stereo and just like cranking up the volume for a time. And that is the only time I can think of in both male and female where you actually have positive feedback. Normally, we like to keep things regulated. We like to keep the volume at a steady level. We've got a negative feedback. And it would actually be negative feedback all through here, right? Keeping the levels normal. And then you've got negative feedback here, keeping the levels nice and normal. So just this big spike at ovulation, and we actually do need to come and sort of crank up the control knob so that the egg is actually released. So it's those spikes in those two gonadotropic hormones that cause ovulation, which again is the whole point of sort of reproduction in the female system, right? The body wants to become pregnant, and it needs to release the egg in order for that to happen. So there's what you need to know for LH and FSH. Pretty straightforward. Big spike at ovulation and a bit of positive feedback. Otherwise, low levels and negative feedback. Now here we're talking about what's happening, second picture, what's happening in the ovary. So ovarian hormones. So we're going to see some names specific to what's going on in the ovary. Now, the phases that we're going to talk about in the ovary, the first 5 days, there's really nothing happening, which is kind of strange in the ovary. The ovary is kind of taking a bit of a break here. So I'm actually just going to put in brackets here. There's really nothing going on. Remember the first 5 days, or 4-ish days, is menses. The actual menstruation, the shedding of the endometrial lining, bleeding, flow, all those different names that people give it. So there's really nothing going on in the ovary in terms of developing an egg quite yet. And then around day 5, we start developing the follicle. So that is called the follicular phase. So the follicular phase coincides with developing the follicle. We have day 14, that's the important day. We've already labeled it up above. That's ovulation. That is the release of the mature egg because the follicle's got it all ready to go. And then hopefully you remember from the last video that after ovulation, your follicle turns into what we had called the dried pineapple ring. Totally not a scientific name or description of the thing, but it kind of looked like it in that picture. And that thing was called the corpus luteum. So your 14 to 28, the second half of this cycle, is now called the luteal phase. Now, your ovarian hormones, you've really just got estrogen. So maybe what I'll do here is we can label the progesterone too, because that's being produced by the corpus luteum. But for the first half, for the follicular phase, you've really only got estrogen to worry about. So maybe let's do this. The ovarian hormones are going to be estrogen and progesterone. Now the progesterone is kind of cool because it doesn't even show up until like the second half of the cycle, not until the corpus luteum shows up. It's the hormone factory that makes it. So what ends up happening here is estrogen. Maybe I'll keep the estrogen pink and I'll switch over the progesterone. Let's make it blue, and I'll label them on the picture as well. So estrogen, it is going to be present for the first part of the cycle because it's helping get that follicle to mature. So it starts out really low and it slowly builds. Am I pink? Yes, I'm pink. And then what we find happens is just like the FSH and the LH had a nice little spike at ovulation, so does estrogen. So estrogen is going to, boom, spike. It does a little positive feedback as well. And then it drops off. And it turns out it doesn't go all the way back down to a low level. We don't sort of draw the same pattern or trend that we did with the LH and the FSH. And that's because once we form the corpus luteum in that luteal phase, that corpus luteum is going to keep producing estrogen. And so we get what I like to just call like a medium level of it. And then it's going to drop off towards the end. So it starts out low, it builds, it spikes, and then it stays at like a medium level. So that is your estrogen hormone level portion of that, that chart. And then your progesterone, remember, it only shows up when the corpus luteum shows up because the corpus luteum is going to make it. So it basically sits at 0. Again, I'm trying to draw a horizontal line. Forgive me for being a little bit crooked. Day 14 is ovulation. After day 14 is where we start to see the corpus luteum begin forming. And so that's when it starts making lots of progesterone. So progesterone is going to build up. And it actually stays at quite a high level for a series of days. And then remember that at some point the female body says, hey, we've put in all this energy, all this time, all these hormones. We've thickened up the uterus. We've got it exactly like we want it. It looks like fertilization, implantation is not going to happen. And then boom, it drops right off as well. So that is what your levels of progesterone are going to look like. They are only formed by the corpus, or progesterone is only formed by the corpus luteum. So you don't have any in the first 14 days because there is no corpus luteum until after ovulation. And then the progesterone is nice and high. Maybe what we could do here as well is we could label, I'm going to try labeling this without hopefully it looking too jumbled. So I'm going to do my best here. Follicular phase is where we are developing the follicle. So that was the whole process of oogenesis that Mr. Waterman did in the second video, or you can check out my PowerPoint. That whole like primary follicle, secondary follicle, Graafian follicle was what we called it when we were sort of ready to go. Ovulation, we release the egg. I guess the technical name for a single egg is ovum. And then the luteal phase is where we have the corpus luteum formed. And again, that's where that name comes from, right? Luteum, luteal phase. So just to give us an idea of sort of what's actually happening in the ovary during these times with those hormones. So the first 5 to 14 days, we're developing that follicle, going through oogenesis. We then release the egg from the Graafian follicle on day 14, ovulation. And then the follicle turns into the corpus luteum, and it's that hormone factory cranking out both estrogen but lots of progesterone. The reason that we have these higher levels of estrogen and progesterone in the second half of the cycle is because those hormones control what happens in the uterus. So this last graph, we're not talking about hormones anymore. We're talking about the thickness of the uterus. And you can see that's what it's labeled as here. So instead of sort of saying amount, it would actually be like thickness on the side, on that y-axis. So what's happening in the uterus is, remember, the first 5 days are menses. So that's when the endometrial lining is shed, that sort of bleeding phase. So the thickness, it actually starts really high because the body has sort of put all this time and effort into building up the thickness, and then it sheds. So the level is going to go way down. So that endometrial lining thickness decreases. And I'll put in brackets here, it's the shedding of that endometrial lining. And then at day 5, once that follicle development starts, that's the female body saying, okay, let's try again. Let's start from scratch. Let's see if we can get this uterus all built up for some potential implantation. The weird thing here now is we don't call this phase the follicular phase, even though it coincides with the follicular phase. We call it the follicular phase if we're looking at the ovary, but that same time period in the uterus is called the proliferative phase. And the proliferative phase is when we first start thickening the endometrial lining. So maybe I'll just say thickening starts. So what ends up happening is your uterus starts building up in terms of its thickness. Now, day 14 is ovulation, but ovulation is an event that occurs in the ovary, right? It's that follicle releasing the mature ovum. There's really nothing special happening in the uterus itself. So I'm actually not even going to worry about labeling ovulation, because in the uterus, that's not an important day. Once we've passed ovulation and we get into the luteal phase, remember that we've got lots of progesterone that starts to show up, and estrogen is at a fairly high level as well. And those two things are going to cause the uterus to really start thickening up and building up a big blood supply and getting all that mucus ready to go, trying to get the perfect conditions for implantation of an egg. So we call that the secretory or secretory phase. And that is lots of blood supply and mucus. And the uterus keeps thickening at the same time. But specifically now we get this nice big blood supply. We get things nice and sticky for implanting. And so the uterus sort of builds up and it gets thick, thick, thick. And the reason it's doing that, the reason that we have the blood supply and the mucus production is because of progesterone and estrogen. So I'll even put here, due to progesterone and estrogen. So remember, these ovarian hormones are controlling what happens in the uterus. So we get this uterine lining nice and thick through the secretory phase. And then remember, around day 28, we're building, we're getting things ready, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. And that's where I'll just sort of draw this as starting to drop off. And then really what's happening, you don't have to draw this line, is it loops back to that stage right there, where we're starting to shed, and then, hey, look, just loop it back around, and we're back into menses. And again, why does the menses happen? Menses happens because progesterone and estrogen drop off, right? Remember that these hormones are controlling what's happening in the uterus. So if we take away the corpus luteum, which means we take away progesterone and estrogen, then the uterus basically gives up and we just shed that lining. So I guess we could even label that. Just so hopefully this is all making sense, right? Why does that lining just drop right off? We have no corpus luteum. Remember, I think I said in the last video, it gives up the ghost, right? It just breaks down. No corpus luteum, which means no progesterone or estrogen. And so the uterus sheds. And then we start to build estrogen up. The thickness starts increasing. We reform a corpus luteum. We get lots of progesterone. Hey, look, we really build up that uterus again. The cycle continues. So hopefully that is helpful to you. Again, this is tricky. There's a lot going on. So if there's any part of this that you still need more clarification about, fire me an email, or even better yet, let's chat about it in a Zoom meeting. So again, I'd love to say hi. I'd love to chat with you about female reproductive hormones. Let's make sure we can get this all sorted out. Ladies who are watching this, your body is absolutely amazing, right? Look at the complexity just in hormones and what's happening in your ovaries and your uterus. It's really, really amazing how on a monthly basis, your body is really doing its best to prepare itself for pregnancy. Even though for people, for humans, right, we are not necessarily wanting to get pregnant every month. In fact, most people, most months don't want to become pregnant. So we are sort of separated from nature. I think everybody knows this, where most animals, it's like eat and breed. They wake up in the morning and those are the two things that they're trying to do. For humans, it's definitely eat and maybe breeding without actual pregnancy. Yeah, something like that. But again, we're not really just trying to pass on our genetic information like a lot of other animals or organisms are, even though our body doesn't always agree with that, right? Our body is pretty much constantly doing its best to get itself ready to become pregnant. One other thing that I'll throw into this video, just because I like to talk and I've got some time, this one's not quite 30 minutes yet, is for females a really common option of birth control. We're talking about contraception, right? How we typically don't want to become pregnant. One of the ways that you can do that is you can take a birth control pill, which quite often is combined with estrogen and progesterone. And what's really interesting about taking progesterone and estrogen is if you keep these levels high by taking a birth control pill, what you're going to do is you are going to slow down or stop. You actually kind of get stuck in this luteal phase in your ovaries, and you stop follicular phase, right? It's like adding in somebody turning down the volume. So by keeping estrogen and progesterone high, there's negative feedback, which means this never happens. This spike in LH and FSH, because it tricks your body into thinking, oh, we're like just in this back half of the system. So, or back half of the cycle. So your LH and your FSH stay low. Your progesterone and your estrogen stay high, which is fine. There's nothing there that's happening. And what it actually can do is it can stop these spikes in LH and FSH, which stops ovulation and can really reduce the whole follicular phase. So it's a little bit counterintuitive until you understand how a negative feedback works, because a lot of times females will look at this lesson and they'll go, well, doesn't giving me progesterone and estrogen make me more fertile? Wouldn't that work by giving me more of the hormones that my body is using to prepare itself for fertilization, for pregnancy? And you might assume that, right? But again, it's kind of a cool system where if you can just keep these levels high on and on and on and on for months and months or years and years, right? Depending on how long you're taking birth control, then you're keeping your LH and your FSH low for a long, long time, which means without this spike, you're never going to release an egg. And if you've never matured and released an egg, then you can't really become pregnant, right? There's no egg there, mature ovum, for sperm to even fertilize in the first place. So it's a pretty cool system that we've come up with to sort of trick the body into preventing some spikes in hormones that would cause an egg to be released. Now, that's not to say that birth control is perfect, right? I think that the rate of birth control pills, if taken properly for females, the success rate is very high in terms of its preventing pregnancy, but it's not perfect. So don't think you can just go on birth control and never get pregnant. It still does happen to people, especially if you miss a day or something like that, because sometimes, remember, your body, for females, it's wanting to get pregnant right away, right? It's working hard to get pregnant and to keep the conditions optimal for fertilization. And if you forget a day or two somewhere in your birth control pill taking cycle, and you get that little bump in LH and FSH, it might be enough to actually cause ovulation. And once that egg has been released, now conditions are good to potentially have fertilization and implantation. So it's one of those like, hey, it works really great in theory, but you can't miss any days, right? Anyways, that would also be a conversation worth happening for maybe for guys too, right? Like, hey, how does all that work? So again, like I said, second plug, join me on Zoom. Let's have a further conversation about this stuff. I think it'd be really, really interesting. There's some good stuff to know, and a lot of the things like contraceptive methods are good things for young people like you to discuss and know about as well. We'll call it sort of the family life portion of Anatomy and Physiology 12. So I hope this video was helpful, and I hope to chat with you very soon in our next Zoom meeting. Take care, everybody.